Charlotte and I have moved 14 times in our marriage of 42 years. I think that's a lot as I look back on it. Now, sometimes it was just across the valley in Breckenridge. Other times it was to an adjacent state, Kentucky to Tennessee, then Tennessee to Colorado, then Colorado to California. And several times it has been across multiple time zones. I'm sure there are some of you here that have moved more than that, and some who have moved less. But whether you've moved once or twice, or 14 or more times, the process of moving, deciding what stays, what goes, creates anxiety, for some more than others. In our move from Nashville to Breckenridge, we loaded up, Charlotte and I, over 500 vinyl albums, and they went to the landfill. I knew that we weren't going to have the space to keep that collection in our home. And it was a sad day, but it also motivated me to embrace the next adventure and step that we were taking together as a family in moving to Colorado. In Eureka, Charlotte and I boxed up 30 cases of books, and we gave them away in consignment. Now, by now, you probably know I love music and I love books. But we knew that our life pattern was going to involve more and more mobility. And so those books needed to be regifted and given to someone else's bookshelf. Each and every time that we have moved, our primary goal has been to establish home. Home is important to us, to both of us. Now, sometimes home is connected to the stuff that surrounds us, connects us to our past, like the albums and the books. But for us, home has to be something else, something more. Sometimes we have succeeded in finding home. Sometimes we haven't. Sometimes we found ourselves just living in a place, in a space. We develop new habits and new routines, and no matter how nice that place was, it just wasn't home. Now, this is the first time we've ever lived in a rectory, so that's been both a blessing and a challenge. It's a blessing because we can be closer to the church and to the Mountain View Parish. It's not about getting to work quicker. It's about being immersed in the ethos of the area that's important to me. So it is a blessing that we can be close. It's a challenge to us because it isn't a floor plan that we would choose or a set of surroundings. We arrived here as resident aliens, and hopefully we would find our way in this new land with new values. And the rectory is also one of the smallest spaces that we've ever lived, so I'm glad that I parted with those albums and the books before we moved here. But we've discovered, primarily through Charlotte's teaching practice and the families that come to our home for those lessons, that many of the families also are in smaller spaces. So we've begun to recalculate home. Our children who are grown, and they live thousands of miles away from us. When we moved to California, they both needed to make a pilgrimage to Eureka. They needed to come to see where we lived, to spend some time there. Then 3 years ago, when we moved here to Sunnyvale, they needed to make a pilgrimage again. I believe that they needed to reset their compass to where is home. We now know and have learned from our multiple moves, home is more than stuff and more than things. Home is more than environment or diversity of culture or work or more than time spent in one space and place. Home is where the essence of us is able to come alive and be alive. It's where we are the most content and the most connected. Now, whether you live there presently now, or you're still searching for that place called home, when you think of home, I hope you'll always think of home is a safe place and a sanctuary for your spirit. Several years ago, I had a parishioner who had reached the end of her life, and the doctor said she would not be able to continue to live for much longer. And the best estimate that they could give her was weeks, not months, not years, not open-ended. I was there the day that a doctor came in and said to her, I need for you to make some achievable goals in the last weeks of your life. And so she thought about it for a bit, and then she said to the doctor, here's what I want to do. I want to get strong enough so that I can leave the hospital and go home. A 3-room assisted living apartment. So she set about getting stronger. It was harder than you would think, her willing herself into better health and strength. We thought we might lose her one weekend, but then she decided that she was going to get better so she could go home. She died several weeks later, but she was strong enough to go back home. In our continuing conversations with John's Gospel, Jesus speaks of spiritual nourishment that comes from him, the life we all need to be transformed into new beings. And as we have discovered, the language has gotten increasingly graphic. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood. We want to say, enough already. We get it. Can't we just move on now? And we can, because when we do, it's the very next phrase that opens up this gospel for us today. Abide in me. He just says it once today, but he says it 5 more times in John's gospel. It's a Jesus phrase. Some translations have it as live in me. This living in Jesus is a transformative, deep experience. It holds the essence of life, the place where we can be the most alive, the most content, the most connected. It is the safe place for us. It is a sanctuary for our spirits. It's the difference in living in a house and living at home. Jesus is inviting us to be home with him just as he is home with God. Because home, truly, is where the heart is. Abiding in the Lord is more than habits or routines, more than stuff or things, more than an environment, more than history. There's something more for the sanctuary of our spirits. To be open to the faith required to begin a new adventure and to recognize we too may need to reset our spiritual compass. Jesus welcomes us and tells us that he will nourish our spirit in a way that all of life will take on a new meaning if you will abide in him. In the first reading this morning from the book of Joshua, this famous declaration of faith culminates in what had been an unsettled time. It was a disconnected and a longing time. For decades, the delivered Israelites had been in the wilderness looking for home. Children were born. They grew up. Some were married and had their own children. Life carried on. Some lives came to a close. Some wished that they could go back to what had been long ago. On this day recounted in Scripture, their leader had brought them together. And he said, "You have arrived now. It's time to make a decision. What are you going to do?" He asked them how they would respond to encourage this transformation from a house of slavery to their new home. And then jumping to our gospel this morning, a different wandering and unsettling is also portrayed today. Like many of those who had been willing to call themselves disciples of Jesus, which is evidently a term used quite loosely at this point in the gospel story. It was anyone who was following or trailing Jesus physically from place to place. And to some degree or another, they were accepting that Jesus was a good teacher. He had good things for living. Jesus now says, "You have arrived." Now, surely they would embrace this gift of Jesus, God in their midst, all that they had seen and experienced. And they would take this next step of transformation and go through the door with Him. But like them, there will be those who will, for any number of reasons, just walk on by or turn around and walk away because they're still looking for something else. And we, just like the first seekers, are curious. And at the same time, we become calloused to this invitation of transformation to the life that Christ offers us. When Jesus asked them, "What are you going to do?" It's Peter's words today who nudge us. We have looked and we have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. Joshua asks us what we will do today as well and leads by example, declaring what he's going to do. He says, "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." What are we going to do? Jesus extends to us this open door. Abide in me. Welcome home.